Hi Steinbeck fans! My name is Lisa. I'm the archivist for the National Steinbeck Center. In this series, called Steinbeck's PHALANX, we explore the relationships in Steinbeck's life and how they influenced him and his work. In last week's video, I spoke about the friendship between Ed Ricketts and John Steinbeck and mentioned, in passing, the group of friends, writers, artists, and bohemians that was centered on Ed's lab. On the suggestion of one of our viewers, Alan, I'll dive into this group a little bit more. Now, the important thing to remember is that each of these people's lives would be deserving of a whole book in and of itself. So, across several videos, I'll discuss a few of the people in the group. Maybe 2 or 3, depending on how much information I have access to, but please understand, I'm just scratching the surface here. So, to set the stage a little bit, the lab group, as it relates to Steinbeck, was at its height in the early 1930s. The Great Depression was in full swing, and Bruce Arras, one of the artists in the group, describes what it was like in his book, Inside Cannery Row. He said that life could have been worse during this time. Since the area was a summer getaway, there was housing to be had, at least in the winter, relatively cheaply. And, of course, the climate of Pacific Grove in Monterey is milder than most. The canneries in Monterey provided seasonal work, even if it was grueling and malodorous, and the same resource that drew the canneries could also be exploited by anyone. Steinbeck writes in A Primer on the 30s that you have to be pretty stupid to live by the ocean and starve. Now, let's spend the rest of this video talking about Jack Calvin, who, as I said in the video on Ed Ricketts and Steinbeck, is the connection that brought Steinbeck and Ricketts together. Born in 1901, Jack Calvin was a multi-talented individual, but he really stood out as a photographer, writer, and naturalist. He's originally from Montana, but moved out to California when his father died. From then on, he lived out here on the West Coast. And while working on his master's degree in English literature from Stanford, he worked for the California Packers Association on the Star of Zealand, which he sailed from Alaska to the Bering Strait. And this trip was the basis for his writing a young adult works called Square Rigged in 1929 and Fisherman 28 in 1930. He wrote both of these works while living here in Carmel. Overall, I have to say, it seemed like it was an excellent place for Jack to end up. He met his wife, Mary Kashevaroff, here, as well as Ed Ricketts. Ed was in the habit of inviting friends to come along on collecting trips, and Jack was one of the invitees one of those days. And being able to spend so much time together, they found out that they had a lot of shared interests in music, life philosophy, and of course, most importantly, wine. In an interview, Jack remembers suggesting the idea of a pocket guide, which Ricketts said he would do if Jack helped. And so in the end, Jack Calvin did help and did the photography for Between Pacific Tides, which is still in print, running in its 5th edition. So after Jack moved up to Alaska, his knowledge of the area around Sitka and the coast was an incredible help to Ed Ricketts during his trips up north. And to some extent, if you want to find a place that really appreciates Jack Calvin, you have to go 1,500 miles north of Salinas. Calvin operated several businesses in Sitka, wrote a history of the area, and helped with campaigns to establish wilderness areas in southeastern Alaska, and helped found the Sitka Conservation Society. Some of the Calvin family, in association with the Sitka Sound Science Center, also arranged for his works to be reprinted. Like Ed Ricketts, Calvin's influence is felt deeply in ecology and conservation in his own particular sphere, for him, southeastern Alaska. So, as for Steinbeck and Calvin, eventually the situation would become a lot less friendly, unfortunately. While Carol, Steinbeck's first wife, says about Jack Calvin's home, "We met in this very friendly house where a simple jug of wine made a party. You would gather in a ring, sitting on the floor, and drink a jug of wine." Despite this, some friction arose between Steinbeck and Calvin. One of the issues that came up between them was the source of Steinbeck's stories for The Pastures of Heaven. Beth Ingalls was one of the people who socialized regularly with the Steinbecks and the Calvins, and having grown up in Corral de Tierra, she experienced a lot of things that would make for excellent short stories. She spoke about wanting to write these for herself, and she talked about some of these goings-on during these gatherings. So, in this group, a small scandal broke out after The Pastures of Heaven was published, accusing Steinbeck of stealing from Beth. Jack Calvin was one of the people who was upset at Steinbeck. Now, for her part, Beth Ingalls spent many years writing positive reviews of The Pastures of Heaven in local publications. We don't know for certain, but maybe some sort of permission or conversation happened that is lost to history. So another split between Calvin and Steinbeck was based on writing itself. Steinbeck wrote to George Albee in 1931 that, quote, "We have literary acquaintances in Carmel, paper pulp and juvenile. They hate me and despise me because I can't sell anything. I haven't heard a word of from any of my manuscripts for over 3 months. It is nerve-wracking. I would welcome rejections far more than this appalling silence." End quote. So what was going on? In some ways, maybe Steinbeck came off as a little bit snobbish about his work, taking himself too seriously as far as Calvin and the rest of the group were concerned. Steinbeck, for his part, felt that they couldn't even pretend that there was some dignity in the art of writing. And despite this tension, Steinbeck went back to Carmel again and again. Benson suggests in his Steinbeck biography that this may be indicative of some feeling of isolation that Steinbeck felt and his need for literary discussion and feedback. Now, I think it's important to highlight how disagreement and tension can be productive. In part, this is why I talk about these videos as being about relationships, not friendships, which are overwhelmingly positive in nature, whereas relationship is just simply any connection between two or more people. So throughout Steinbeck's writing career, he of course had plenty of setbacks, failures, disagreements, and tension with others. And I don't have any letters or direct evidence of what Steinbeck may have gotten out of his association with Jack Calvin and these literary groups, but I think the snippet of the letter from Steinbeck to Albee is telling in some ways. The issue of actually selling his work did loom large in Steinbeck's mind, as the nerve-wracking 3 months certainly indicates. However, the disagreement on how seriously to take one's writing and the disagreement over writing as an art that Benson mentions goes to show where Steinbeck stood in terms of the, well, infinite number of ways to look at writing. We see that this also in other letters that Steinbeck wrote, about wanting to capture something that was true and real about the world. Now, this isn't to say that young adult fiction or even picture books can't say something true or real about the world, but I think this does indicate Steinbeck's view on writing, that maybe more traditional fiction works and pieces of literature were a better vehicle for this kind of truth than, say, young adult fiction or the paper pulp novels that he somewhat disparages in that line with George Albee. So, I hope you have enjoyed watching this video. Don't forget, you members, you're always welcome to email me at archives@steinbeck.org for your questions and suggestions for video topics. So thank you again, Alan, for your email to me last week. It's good to hear from you, and I hope you're doing well. Now, don't forget, you can always find more information about what we're doing at our website, steinbeck.org, as well as upcoming events will be published on our Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook pages. So until next time, happy reading.